Students, faculty, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Shell Distinguished Lecture Series of the James A. Baker III Institute for Public Policy of Rice University. Following his remarks, President Clinton has very generously agreed to respond to questions that have been submitted to us by the Rice University students. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you David Leebran, the President of Rice University.
Thank you very much, Ed, and thank you for your tireless leadership of the Baker Institute. It's very brave of you to be up here with 3 lawyers. I want to extend on behalf of the university our warmest welcome to President Clinton. Last time we were together was at my last employer, Columbia University, where we marked the 50th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. And today, as we at Rice approach the 40th anniversary of the admission of African Americans to Rice University, we are very pleased to welcome you here. I understand it's your first visit to the Rice University campus. You've seen and remarked how beautiful it is. We surely hope it won't be your last visit to the Rice University campus. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Secretary James Baker, who of course needs no introduction. As all of you know, he has served in senior government positions under 3 presidents. As Undersecretary of Commerce to President Gerald Ford, as White House Chief of Staff to President Reagan, and then as the 67th Secretary of the Treasury under President Reagan, and then as the 61st Secretary of State under President George Bush. He is the author of several books, most recently his memoir, Work Hard, Study, and Keep Out of Politics. Happily, he only listened to 2 of those 3 admonitions. I do want to tell you, and he didn't ask me to do this, that the book is still available in bookstores everywhere. Secretary Baker has provided the vision behind the Baker Institute, and I know from my conversations with him how pleased he is that it has emerged as one of the premier nonpartisan public policy institutes in the country. The Baker Institute has served both as an important and independent voice for public policy analysis and the vehicle for bringing prominent public figures, such as President Clinton, and important issues of our times to the Rice campus. Rice has no better friend than Secretary Baker. Please join me in welcoming him to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It is really a pleasure and a privilege for me to introduce our speaker to you today. His presence here honors not just the Baker Institute, of course, but Rice University as a whole. I have to tell you, there were times when we wondered whether this day would ever come. You see, we've been trying to get our speaker here for quite a number of years. We began to think that if things dragged on another couple of years, we'd have to start all over again and invite the next President Clinton. But now, Mr. President, please do me a favor and tell the senator that of course, cannot be an endorsement. In many ways, our speaker's life, ladies and gentlemen, embodies the American dream. Born to modest circumstances in Hope, Arkansas, a meeting with President Kennedy in 1962 inspired him to enter a life of public service. After attending Georgetown, Oxford, and Yale, he entered politics in his home state, being elected lieutenant governor in 1976 and governor no less than 5 times between 1978 and 1990. In October 1991, he announced his candidacy for the Democratic presidential nomination. I remember it well. At that time, our Speaker was the darkest of dark horses, given scant chance of success by most political pundits. 13 months later, he was president. And the rest, they say, is history. Then and later, anyone who underestimated Bill Clinton would learn better the hard way. An individual of amazing tenacity and breathtaking energy, he has made a career of defying the odds and of confounding the experts. During his 2 terms in the White House, President Clinton led the United States during a period of dramatic change at home and abroad. And when he left office in January 2001, he shared with Ronald Reagan the highest job approval ratings of any president since World War II. It comes as no surprise to this audience to know that our Speaker and I have often found ourselves on opposite sides of political and policy divides. Yet I have always respected his extraordinary political skills, his grasp of the nuances of policy, whether it's foreign or domestic, and his deep commitment to public service. Not least, despite our differences, we share a profound appreciation of the imperative of American engagement on the world scene, whether by expanding free trade in the Western Hemisphere or by serving as an honest broker in the Middle East. Our Speaker's dedication to public service has continued to shape his life since leaving office. The Clinton Global Initiative that he founded has focused on such critical areas as HIV/AIDS, economic empowerment, leadership development, and racial, ethnic, and religious conflict mitigation. Reaching across partisan divisions, he and President George H.W. Bush led efforts to assist survivors of the Indian Ocean tsunami and Hurricane Katrina. Last year, our Speaker met with the Iraq Study Group. When he finished, everyone there, Democrat and Republican alike, was impressed by his incisive analysis and by his policy suggestions. So I know all of you join me in eagerly awaiting his remarks today. It is my distinct privilege and honor, ladies and gentlemen, to present to you the 42nd President of the United States, William Jefferson Clinton. Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Secretary Baker, Mr. President, Ed, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. I want to especially thank Neil Lane, who's now a professor here, who was my science advisor, and Mayor and Mrs. Lanier, who supported me when I was one of those dark horses that Jim talked about, and others in this audience who've been my friends for many years. I thank you for being here. I'm indebted to all the people who have spoken already. That your president mentioned that we had a wonderful day when he was Dean of Columbia Law School, observing the anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education. Ed Derigian was the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs and then Ambassador to Israel when I was president. 2 difficult and often thankless jobs. And he has continued to work as an advisor to my global initiative on religious and racial ethnic reconciliation. Jim Baker, despite all of our differences, which we blow up for the crowd sometime, supported the administration when we tried to pass NAFTA, worked for the United Nations to solve the problem in Western Sahara when I was president, supported us in the ratification of the Chemical Weapons Convention, which banned chemical weapons, very, very important issue with the rise of terrorist groups. He supported my decision to bomb Iraq's suspected weapon sites when the UN inspectors were kicked out in 1998. And Thomas Ricks, the Washington Post Pentagon correspondent, has written a book about Iraq called Fiasco, in which he says, according to those people who were captured after this current conflict, we destroyed the remaining stocks of chemical and biological weapons, something that would have been difficult to do without bipartisan support. Most important to me of all, he supported the 8 years we worked, just as he did, to make a lasting peace in the Middle East. And I am particularly grateful for his leadership of the Iraq Study Group. You may have questions about that. I did enjoy my time with him. I was so unusually frank. I'm not used to saying some of the things I did in front of 4 or 5 ardent, articulate, energetic Republicans, and I was honored that none of it leaked. Now, having said all that, you're entitled to know the real reason that I'm here today. I got the biggest speaker's fee I have ever received. No. Not 1 red cent. But I got Jim Baker's solemn promise that in the event of an election challenge in 2008, he will not represent the Republican nominee for president. I made that up on the spot. I really don't have that commitment. Let me say first to all the students here, we're going to have time for questions, and I will try to speak a little bit in shorthand today, but when I go across the world today, not just in America, but anywhere I speak, I try to say to people that any concerned citizen needs a worldview, a framework within which to absorb and evaluate all the apparently disparate events that are going on. Otherwise, when you look at the television news or read the papers, it's the political equivalent of chaos theory in physics. All these things seem to be bumping together and seem to be unconnected one to the other. And so what I always try to do is to tell you how I view the world, the prism through which I absorb and evaluate world events, and which I use to decide what my position is on any given issue. You do not have to agree with the way I think about this, and doubtless some of you won't, but you need your own way of thinking about it. You need a framework within which to view all the things that are emerging and coming at us so rapidly. So for whatever it's worth, I find it easiest to arrive at by asking and answering some very simple questions. First question: what is the fundamental character of the 21st century world? Most people would say, well, obviously it's the age of globalization. I prefer the term interdependence because globalization has, for most of us, primarily an economic meaning. In fact, when we moved from the 19th to the 20th century leading up to World War I, the major countries were about as trade dependent as they are today. But it goes far beyond that. There's far more movement of money today. There's far more sharing of information technology today. There's far more of a common culture, far more of a common awareness. There's far more immigration and burgeoning diversities in all the wealthy countries of the world that would have been unthinkable even with the first great wave of immigration into the United States. Now, is it a good thing? Second question. My answer is yes, but. Yes, it's really good for virtually everybody in this room today. I mean, if you're a student, you got to go to one of the great universities in the world. Another reason I'm grateful to be here, by the way, when I was in high school, my performance in science was not good enough to get me here on my own. So if you're a student, it's good. And if you got invited here because you're a distinguished friend of the university or the Baker program, then you've done well in life, and it's been good for you. But the interdependent world is unequal, unstable, and unsustainable. It is still forming. It is unequal. Around the world, half the world's people still live on less than $2 a day. Since 1973, except for the 4 years of my second term, median income, family income, has been flat. It is unstable because of terrorism, the prospect that weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, and nuclear, will fall into more hands, the increasing sophistication of conventional weapons, and all kinds of other threats that, because we have open borders, we're all more vulnerable to. I think it is highly unlikely that the 21st century will claim as many innocent lives as the 20th century did, unless we just lose our minds. The difference is, except in World War II, when we were even afraid of attacks on our shores, and we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, Americans felt relatively insulated. Now people everywhere know they can be attacked in the culture of the modern world. Your chances of it are still small, but there is a sense that we have a shared vulnerability. And finally, the interdependent age is unsustainable on its current course because of climate change and resource depletion. Matthew Simmons, who's probably a friend of yours, a distinguished Republican petroleum investor, says we got about 35 years of recoverable oil left. Exxon says he's crazy, we got about 100 years left. According to carbon dating, the oldest known city in civilization is Jericho in the Middle East. It's 10,000 years old. So if we got 100 years of oil left, that's recoverable and really gives a net positive balance. That means you have 1% of the whole history of civilization to burn oil. No one I know believes we can move off an oil platform in 35 years, because while we use oil for 70% of our oil we use for transportation, it's the stuff that the other 30% does that we really don't have a usable substitute for. We have other resource depletion issues. We have a chronic water shortage. 1 billion people today don't ever get a clean glass of water. And it will get worse if the climate warms and more water that's drinkable evaporates. We have significant erosion of topsoil and loss of biodiversity, including in the ocean, which threatens the food chain. 90% of the world's major fishing areas now are understocked. So, if we live in an interdependent world that's good for us and not so good for half the people, and if it's unequal, unstable, and unsustainable, it's clear what the mission of thoughtful people all over the world is in the 21st century. We have to move from simple interdependence to more integrated communities, locally, nationally, and globally. Because all truly integrated communities, families, businesses, countries, civic clubs, religious organizations, all of them have three things in common: shared responsibilities, shared benefits, and a genuine sense of shared membership, a sense of real belonging, not just occupying the same piece of land. That's easy to say and hard to do. Next question. How would you achieve a more integrated world? How would you move to a world of more shared benefits, responsibilities, and genuine membership? Well, it seems to me that if you're an American, there are essentially four answers to that. One, you do have to have a security policy. There are people with a nihilistic view who would like to undermine our ability and the ability of any country to live in that way because they think they have the whole truth, and they would sooner see ruin if they can't rule. So it is important that we combat terror, weapons of mass destruction, that we deal with the instabilities of failed states, the slaughter of innocents in places like Darfur. We have to have a security strategy. And indeed, the threat of disease spread or climate change should be part of our security strategy. One of the most interesting things about the world to me since I left the White House is now I can turn on the evening news, and if there is a chicken in the last three I saw were in Indonesia, Romania, and India, infected with avian influenza, I can learn on my evening news in Chappaqua, New York, how many chickens were killed within a 3 square kilometer area. That's basically the health guideline. It's inconceivable. Right next, our evening news always starts with the local murder, and even whether the crime rate's going down or up, you're convinced you better lock everything down. But as soon as we get out the crime story, if there's a dead chicken somewhere with avian influenza, you'll know about it. Now, you're laughing, but that is a good thing. That is a very good thing. That shows that the people that we put in positions of responsibility for allowing an epidemic, for not allowing an epidemic to occur, understand that this could destabilize whole societies. At the end of World War I, in 3 great waves, the so-called Spanish flu, which actually started on an army base in Kansas, killed somewhere between 25 and 50 million people in a world with a population less than a third of today's world. And there is no known antidote to avian influenza in a person. So we know it would kill a lot of the people that it infected, just like the Spanish flu did. So you should feel good about that. You've got to have all kinds of security policies. We need to continue to revolutionize the military so we can put a higher percentage of the people who actually join and put a uniform into combat actions if we need, and they need to have more special forces capabilities. We need more language capabilities. We need to continue to modernize the weapon systems and the force protection systems. We need all that. But we also, the second thing we need is to revitalize our diplomacy. Since I'm in Texas, I always say one of my favorite political stories, and it may or may not be true, at least I'll tell you, right? But I've read it a dozen times, is that when Lyndon Johnson was running for Congress the first time, Sam Rayburn came to hear one of his speeches on the courthouse steps, and he got up and just gave his opponent hell. And he thought he'd given a great barn burner of a speech, and so when he got off the platform, he said, "Well, Mr. Sam, how'd I do?" He said, "Lyndon, it was a fine speech." But he said, "Let me tell you something. I've always found it's better not to tell somebody to go to hell unless you can make them go." And there are very few people you can make go to hell. And as we're finding in Iraq and other places, there are limits to our ability to just impose our will, which means that we should always have a preference for diplomacy. And we have to revitalize that. The third and related thing we have to do is to work to build a world with more partners and fewer enemies and terrorists. And we actually know what to do and how to do it to a greater extent than ever before. We have more tools at our disposal to help people work their way out of poverty and develop sustainable lifestyles. We know how to get the 130 million kids who never go to school in school at a very affordable price. We know that we can turn back the tide on AIDS, TB, malaria, and other diseases that disproportionately affect poor people. And we know that if we did it all, it's a lot cheaper than going to war. These kinds of things are embodied in the United Nations declaration called the Millennium Development Goals. It's been estimated that for the United States to pay 25% of the cost of meeting those goals, and we have 20 to 21% of the world's GDP, but a lot of the rest of it would be lost. We'd have to pay about 25% if we really wanted to get this job done, because really poor countries can't afford to contribute. They need our money. It would cost us somewhere between $30 and $35 billion a year in assistance over and above what we're now spending. Now, to give you some idea, we've already spent more than $400 billion in Iraq in just a few years and about $100 billion in Afghanistan. It is cheap. And believe you me, it would make us a lot of friends. How do I know that? Well, arguably the most successful military operation the United States has conducted in the Muslim world since 2001 is the Humanitarian Airlift in Indonesia, the world's biggest Muslim country after the tsunami. I noticed a fascinating poll a year later. Approval of the United States had gone from 30 to 60% in Indonesia. This was after the Iraq War was underway, right? Because the tsunami didn't occur until Christmas of 2004. Approval of bin Laden had gone from 58 to 28%. He didn't do anything to them. But when they were flat on their back, he didn't do anything for them either. And I personally, with former President Bush, did go many times to Indonesia, and then wound up having to go some more when I took over the U.S. responsibility for the UN to continue the reconstruction. And all these Indonesian kids were in grief therapy afterward, those that lost their families and siblings and parents. And one of the things they had them do was draw things. And at first they drew very dark pictures. Then at the end of the cycle they would be drawing kid things, children playing, sunshine, flowers. In the middle, you know what they drew? Pictures of American helicopters dropping food, dropping medicine, dropping lifelines to get people out of the water. What people were doing. I'm just pointing out all this stuff. You do have to have a security policy, but building a war with more partners and fewer terrorists is always cheaper than going to war. And it's the best thing we can do. Now, the final thing that we have to do, and I could keep here tomorrow morning talking about this, so I'll just be in brief outline. The final thing we have to do is to engage in relentless home improvement. Hillary says I've got to stop saying that because there's apparently some show on cable TV called Home Improvement. And one of the reasons once I got out of the White House I wanted to make money is so I would never have to do that myself. But anyway, it's very important. It's important whether you're from a low-income country or a wealthy country. Because if I have worked in enough poor countries now with my AIDS projects and my economic projects to know that we can't grow these countries out of their conditions or get them well or educate their kids or do anything else past a certain point if the government is either burdened by corruption or incapacity, which in most poor places is a bigger problem than corruption and feeds corruption, incapacity. It's a huge problem in wealthy countries because in America, for example, there's a rising tide of protectionism, and our major foreign aid program is trade. If you think about it, I mean, here we are with 21% of the world's GDP, and in a given year we'll be by anywhere between a third and 40% of China's exports. And people like having inexpensive quality goods as long as they don't feel a dramatic economic squeeze. But we've now had 5 years in a row where we've had economic growth, productivity growth among workers, a 40-year high in corporate profits, and median wages flat with the increase in working families without health insurance of 4%. So if I were talking to a different group, and I was up here trying to tell you we ought to spend $40 billion more a year to help poor people work their way out of poverty, ignorance, and disease, and people said, I can't even afford to go to the Walmart, go away, you can readily see that our ability to sustain the kind of world that Secretary Baker and I work together for is dependent on the American dream being constantly renewed. Now, we essentially have three big problems. We've got the economic problem I mentioned, a health care problem, and an energy problem. They're huge systemic problems that we will have to solve in a bipartisan fashion, but if we continue to ignore them, we're going to crater the economy. In health care, I'll bore you with a few statistics, 16 and 11. We spend 16% of income on health care. No other country spends more than 11. First number. 84 and 100. We insure 84% of our people. No other country insures less than 100%. No other wealthy country. Third number, 37. That's the overall ranking of America's health outcomes compared to all other wealthy countries. We're actually a little higher in life expectancy. We're 34th. But we're spending 50% more than anybody else. And last number with which a lot of you will be familiar, $1,500 and $110. $1,500 is how much General Motors has got in health care in every car. $110 is how much Toyota has. Ford is about $1,000. Chrysler, because they're merged with the German company, the Daimler-Benz company, is about $600. Now, I think I'm pretty good at running things, but I don't believe I could spot Toyota, $1,400 a car in healthcare costs, and turn it around. Why is this? One more number or two. Listen to these numbers. 34 and 19. 34% of every healthcare dollar is spent on administrative compliance costs between the insurers and the providers. 19% is the next highest number I can find anywhere in the world. The difference, to give you some idea of what we're talking about in dollars, the difference in 16% of income on healthcare and 11 is $800 billion a year. The difference in 34 and 19, those numbers, into the others, is $300 billion of that $800 billion. $300 billion. We pay to have 2 million people go to work every day and play tug-of-war over health care money. The provider's trying to get paid, and the insurer's trying to keep from paying, or at least delay it long enough to get the float. Now, we can make a decision that we want to let the health care financing tail wag the health care dog from now forever, but don't complain when America can't make cars anymore. Tell people you preferred to give it in administrative costs in an inefficient system. The other differences are we are the only country in the world that gives our pharmaceutical companies a patent with exclusive rights to produce with no price restraints, which is why they don't want us to re-import drugs that they make and send to Canada. And they tell you if you take once those drugs go to Canada and come back, they're so contaminated you'll drop dead if you take them. Now, that's a better case, actually. We get a lot out of having a big pharmaceutical company sector in America. There are good jobs, they do great research, but universities do most of the research today. 58% of the new drugs patented in America in the last 10 years were created by either the government labs or by universities getting federal funds and then licensed back to the drug companies. We may want to continue this, but we can't pretend there's no cost. The other issues relate to medical errors and unnecessary procedures that would be cured in part if we just automated all the records. And Hillary and some other people, we got a big bipartisan effort on that in the Senate. I hope it'll pass soon. Lifestyle choices, basically obesity and violence. We have statistically significant number of children with adult onset diabetes, type 2 diabetes today. That means more blindness, more limb loss, more heart attacks, more strokes, more, you know, the whole deal. And the final issue is we spend more money on the last 2 months of life than any other country. I just buried my 91-year-old stepfather, whom I loved. And we had hospice in, and they were fabulous. And they gave good guidance. But I think the only answer to that in our culture, given our religious convictions, is to have everybody have a living will. But all the other issues have structural responses we have to reply. And if we don't do it, we cannot do it. But we cannot complain then as middle-class lifestyles continue to collapse and if we can't manufacture things. And finally, on energy, it's the same thing. We basically have 4% of the world's population, 21% of its income, emit 25% of its greenhouse gases. And we import 60% of our oil, 70% of which goes to transportation. But that's only a third of the greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gas emissions in America are roughly a third transportation, a third buildings of all kinds, like this one. We're lighting up and being cool. And we're using a lot of energy. And a third manufacturing and the generation of electricity. And all I can tell you is that you can be part of the problem or you can be part of the solution. As long as oil is over $45 a barrel, it is economical today to drastically reduce America's greenhouse gas emissions. The problem is we're not organized very well to do it. The new energy economy is entrepreneurial and underfinanced with an imperfect market because people don't know what their options are. But all we need is for some people to go in and organize the market. For example, when Walmart made a commitment to reduce its packaging and to reduce the amount of miles its trucks were going to have to drive and the amount of stuff they were going to have to take around, and to change its lighting and its freezers, never mind lighting the stores, they're going to save $3.5 billion net of investment in the next 5 years, take the effect of 700,000 cars off the road, and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by tens of millions of tons. That's one company. That's a big company. But the point is, they just got started. That's a 5% reduction. That's hardly anything. And that's how much it is. We are twice as efficient today as we were after the first oil price spike in the 70s. We could easily be twice as efficient again before you do solar, before you do wind, before you explore the nuclear issues, before you do any of that. Every coal-fired power plant that was built before the last couple of years operates at 40% efficiency. That is, if coal turned those lights on, 60% of the coal greenhouse gas emissions that came out because this switch was flipped didn't have anything to do with turning the light on. They can be retrofitted to 65% efficiency. That's more than a 50% increase. We should be for this. This is good economics. But if we don't, then we can't complain when we suffer both the environmental and the economic consequences. So I say we need to get way past all the rhetoric and say this is no big deal. I mean, this is, like going to the moon or something. We can do this. But we just we need to be in the solution business, not in the problem business. And in the business of constant renewal. Last point. Who is supposed to do all this? And the answer is we all are. There are things that government has to do, things the private sector has to do, and things you can do as a citizen. That's what I do now with my foundation. Private citizens have more power to do good in public areas than ever before because there are more rich people than ever before who want to spend their money in an intelligible way, because non-governmental organizations now know what to do, and because people with no money at all who can just give a little bit have the chance to change the world if they all agree on the same thing at the same time. And I will leave you with this thought. In 2004, contributions to the Republican and the Democratic Party in the presidential election from small donors totaled more than contributions from big donors for the first time ever. Why? Because of the Internet in both parties. When the tsunami hit South Asia, Americans gave $1.2 billion, 30% of our households gave, over half of them over the Internet. When the President asked his father and I to help with Katrina, I was up at the New York State Fair the next day making my annual trip up there with Hillary. It's the only place a guy from Arkansas is any good to a senator from New York. State Fair, I know one end of a cow from another, I'm handy up there. And I have boots with holes in them and all that, so I do good there. So I'm walking down the midway, and this lady comes out from behind one of these booths, where you throw things at targets and win stuffed animals. She got a little khaki shirt on with her logo, and she stuffs $50 in my hand. And she said, "This is for the Bush-Clinton Katrina Fund." I'm sorry to give it to you in cash, but as you can see, I'm working. I don't have time to send it over the net. Now, if you're at Rice and you're in, some computer field, you think, well, that's natural. How much money does this woman make working in a fair booth in Syracuse? How much education does she have? Her preferred way of giving is over the Internet. That means if there are millions of people like her who care about anything, whatever it is, they can change the world too, just like Bill Gates. So I leave you with that thought. You're at a great university. You're supposed to be learning. But you have more power to do than any group of Americans ever have. and there's plenty of doing that needs done. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, we have tons of questions from the students, not enough time. I'll try to categorize most of them. Most of them happen to be on foreign policy, and so we'll start. There are several questions on the Middle East, but I think this one, as a prelude, is an important one. And do you think, Mr. President, that the United States is too concerned with the Middle East, given that South America is moving toward a new economic paradigm? The two Asian giants are taking industrial and technical jobs from U.S. workers. Africa is forging new economic ties with China and Russia. China and Russia is looming as the ultimate power broker in Central Asia.
Well, the short answer to the question, as you read it to me, is no. But I believe it was an error to go into Iraq before the UN inspectors finished their job. I think it was an error to go in before we put enough resources into Afghanistan to eliminate Osama bin Laden and the leadership. And I think now we've got too much tied down there and too much obsession there. But it does not mean that we shouldn't be deeply concerned with the Middle East. I think the Saudis did a good thing getting the Hamas and the Fatah factions together, the Palestinians. If they could make a deal and agree to unite behind President Abbas and say, look, and the Hamas would say, as long as we're going into this, we recognize that we support the policy of the government, which is no to terror, yes to negotiations, Israel has a right to exist. And if we can't support that anymore, then we'll get out of the government. If they could get that done, we have a chance to make a peace in the Middle East now again, because a vast majority of the Israelis want it, a vast majority of the Palestinians want it. All the Sunni Arab states are worried about the rise of Iran and a destabilizing Shiite radical movement that could affect them. So you got more Arab states, many more than when I was president, willing to be out front and saying, I'm ready not just to recognize Israel, but to normalize Israel and build a new future together. So from my point of view, we should do that, because if we could give the Palestinians a homeland on the West Bank and Gaza, and they could make common cause with the Israelis in building a common, humane future, it would take at least half the sting out of the terrorist argument in the world. That can't be a bad thing. That's worth a lot of time and attention. Now, do I think we have devoted too little time to Latin America in the last few years? I do. And I think that it is partly explains the appeal of Chavez and the election of Evo Morales in Bolivia and the recent election of Correa in Ecuador. But it's not, I think the more important thing there is, how should we be involved with Latin America? I want to see us rekindle it, but you can't say all these things are like connected. Ask yourself this. It's instead of who you are. If you were a 45-year-old Bolivian miner with 4 children, and your body was old before its time, and you had seen no increase in your living circumstances because of investment in the natural resources in your country by multinational companies, and you thought your children had no better prospects than you, and you certainly couldn't afford to send them to school past a certain point, I bet you would have voted for Evo Morales. He's an honorable man. He's a native Indian, the first one of your own people ever to have a chance to be president. His sister had to serve as his first lady, and she didn't have a dress to go to the inauguration, had to take a bus from this little village where they lived down to La Paz for the inauguration, or up to La Paz for the inauguration. So there are objective realities leading to the election of these people. Now, also, Chavez, as long as he's got $50 oil or better, has got money to throw around. In the end, he will not succeed because the model is not even working in Venezuela. They're not modernizing their infrastructure. They're not educating their people. They're not diversifying their income. In the end, this thing was not going to be sustainable. But it's bound to have a lot of juice now because of the combination of how globalization affects most people in those countries and $50 plus oil. As long as the oil's high and this guy's got money to throw around. What we should do is offer an alternative, hopeful vision and be patient because they're not going to move and neither are we. And we're going to keep getting more Hispanic in America. So we are going to be in the same family in the 21st century, whether we like it or not. We just need to get after it and start working with them more. But you shouldn't give up on the Middle East. It's a big deal. There are Muslims all over the world who would feel completely different about our country and the West generally if we were seen to get a fair and decent deal for the Palestinians in the Middle East. That's what I think.
You've just answered the next two questions I had. What are your thoughts on weighing the threat of a nuclear Iran with the instability that military action would bring, keeping in mind the limited effectiveness of economic sanctions and current constraints on available military capacity?
I think, thank God we don't have to make a decision on this tomorrow. My policy would be to plan for the worst and work for the best. That is, I think it would be a bad thing if Iran had the capacity to make nuclear weapons, not because I think they would drop them on Israel. Because if they did, the same deterrent would work on them as a nation state as worked between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. They know we would not permit that to happen. They would not survive it. Their government would not survive it. Their system would not survive it. The Ayatollah Khomeini's revolution would be a footnote in history if that were over. They know that. But if they were to have a lot of weapons-grade material, given their active support of Hezbollah and their other involvement with terrorist operations, the chances that some of that material could find its way into terrorist hands who could in turn make smaller so-called nuclear dirty bombs and who have harder to reach targets are significant. And it would change the psychology of the Middle East, and it's not good for them. It's also very expensive and very dangerous to maintain a nuclear arsenal. It doesn't make even any sense. Now, having said that, we should be working for the best because, ironically, once Hamas won the election for the Palestinians, the Hamas government joined the Iranian government in being the two governments in the Middle East that were most at variance with their own people and their attitudes toward the rest of the world. The week after the Hamas vote, there was a poll in the Palestinian territories. Here were the results. Okay, you got Hamas. Do you want Sharia law now? 4%, yes. Do you want Hamas to disavow terror? 73%, yes. Do you want them to make a just and lasting peace with Israel? 82%, yes. Well, why did you vote for them? Because we thought they were more honest, more competent, and we don't think there was going to be a peace, and these people can deliver the goods. Same thing happened with Ahmadinejad. In Iran, when I was president, Iran was the only country, this is no slam, this is not partisan, Jim. Iran was the only country in the world that voted 6 times for the most progressive candidates they could vote for by margins of 66 to 70%. Go back through your memory. Twice for the mayors, twice for the parliament, twice for the president. For Hatmi. 66 to 70% of the time. Every time, regular as clockwork, people that wanted to reach out and modernize and give women a larger role and all that stuff. And the voters got frustrated because Iran's the only country in the world with 2 governments. And the religious council run by Ayatollah Khomeini can strike people off the ballot, strike laws from the books, and they control the funds for terror and for the military and for the intelligence. So the voters thought, imagine you're a voter in Iran. Ahmadinejad is a religious conservative. These guys like him, and he's an honest populist mayor. He puts on the uniform of the street cleaners and goes out and work, and he's straight. And he's promising also to give us more of the oil money. He basically promised to cut them all a check. And that's why he won. Now you have even the conservatives criticizing his nuclear position, his denial of the Holocaust, his confrontational status. So all I'm saying, most experts say it will take them another year to get these centrifuges working, and another year to two after that to have enough fissile material to make a bomb. That gives us a little time, and we should be working like holy hell to avoid a military confrontation. We should not take it off the table, but we shouldn't talk about it too much. We should tell the Iranians, we do not want this. We want a partnership with you. You have a rich and noble culture. You have a right to elect whoever you want, but this is madness. And you can't expect us to sit by while you threaten a whole people in the Middle East and at the same time say, well, I just really want it for peaceful nuclear purposes, but then you defy the very UN systems that would guarantee that you could get nuclear power that would be peacefully useful but could never be weaponized. So that's the deal. We just got to keep working at it. We can't resolve this today. And it's a very serious matter. And I hope that we can do it with a national consensus.
Thank you. Mr. President, the students have put me in a really tough spot with this question, with both you and Secretary Baker. Since we are here at the Baker Institute, what do you think of James A. Baker III's role in getting George W. Bush elected in 2000?
Oh, God, I'm glad I'm not running for anything anymore. I thought when I saw him up there as the somber head of the Baker-Hamilton Commission on Iraq about that old proverb that life's greatest curse is answered prayers. And I thought, first of all, look, he did a good job. That's what he hired on to do, and he did a good job. And he did a better job than our side did in making the argument. And I never make the mistake of underestimating people on the other side of me in a fight. My quarrel was not with him, it was with the Supreme Court decision. I think the Supreme Court decision will go down in history as one of the 5 worst decisions ever rendered by the United States Supreme Court. But I'm very encouraged that the new Republican governor of Florida, Charlie Crist, has announced his support for a comprehensive election reform which will make this go away. The real problem is that the more complex an environment, and Florida is a complex electoral environment. You've got a lot of first-generation immigrants. You've got a lot of people whose first language is not English. You've got a lot of people that move around all the time within Florida. Not easy to run an election there. And they got a total jackleg system that is ripe either for abuse or for mess-ups that look like abuse. One of the things I learned when I was president, and I'm sure Jim had the same experience, even smart people mess up. But when you're in politics and the press is covering you, they don't believe there's any such thing as a screw-up. They think if something goes wrong, you did it on purpose for the darkest of motives. So we don't know that. But I like this election reform because in the last election in Florida, the Democrats lost a House seat by 600 votes. And it was Catherine Harris's old seat. And we were running a kind of moderate Democrat woman who owned a bank that she started out as a bank teller in. Really impressive woman, Christine Jennings. And she lost the 3 rural Republican counties and won the bigger county. But she lost the total by 600 votes. The problem was that 18,000 votes disappeared in the big county, the one she carried big. And they said it was just a screw-up with these voting machines. The problem was it's inherently, or that people just didn't vote, it's inherently not credible because the only race left by election day was the Congress race. Even the governor's race was over. Everybody knew it. The only race of consuming interest was the Congress race, and they are taking the unusual position that it was so interesting that 18,000 people decided to vote in every other race and let that one go. Now, they got us, the system is terrible, and in the end, it's going to hurt everybody. So the Governor Chris is apparently committed to work with the Democrats and Republicans to give us a good election system in Florida, and as we know now, all America has a big stake in that. And that's what you should work for. We just need to clean up the system and then let them vote for whoever they want to.
Thank you, Mr. President. Though President Bush will soon be joining your ranks, you are currently the only living two-term president. For the first 150 years of the presidency, no presidents were elected for more than 2 terms. Given that, and given the extraordinary circumstances that prompted FDR to seek a 3rd and a 4th term, are term limits necessary? This has a lot of local implications here in Houston and Texas.
Well, in general, I think, by the way, in general, I think state legislative term limits are too severe. Because, especially in states where you have part-time legislators, because it takes a few years to really acquire a lot of knowledge. And I worry, like in my state in Arkansas, we've adopted very strict limits on how long you can serve in the House and Senate. And a lot of voters will take somebody they really love, and when that man or woman runs out of the House term, they'll send him to the Senate. They run out of the Senate term, they'll send them back to the House. It's because people are always for term limits in general and against them in particular. They say, oh, I've got to vote for term limits, otherwise I'll keep sinning and voting for that old rascal. You know, I can't help myself. But in the context of state legislators, I think if you have a part-time legislature, you wind up shifting a disproportionate amount of influence to the permanent staff by having too much term limits. So that's my comment on the Arkansas system, the Texas system, whatever. With regard to the presidency, I think George Washington set a good precedent. I don't think anyone should run for a 3rd term except under unusual circumstances. Maybe what we should do is to do what some states do with executive term limits. There's a better argument for executive term limits for all kinds of obvious reasons, as all of us who've been in executive positions know. But maybe it would be better, since people are maintaining their capacity to be active and alert well into their 70s and maybe their early 80s. I mean, if Secretary Baker's lost half a step from when he was in government, I haven't noticed it. And so maybe what we should do is to say that, you know, you can serve 2 consecutive terms. Then if you're young and healthy and compos mentis and the country has some sort of problem that would require your being called back, you could do it. I don't think if we ever change it, I don't think it should affect me or anyone else who was under the old system. It should only be done prospectively. But you can't tell. I mean, the average person is going to live a lot longer, be active a lot longer, and yet younger and younger people will also be eligible to be elected president, just in public's consciousness. The age limit hadn't changed, but the way we think about it has. Maybe that's what we ought to have. But there's no such thing as a perfect system here. And there's plenty of good people. I noticed that there's no shortage of people that want that job, so I think it's highly unlikely that the term limit change will ever occur. I told somebody the Republicans didn't want me back and all the Democrats wanted to be president. There's no way they're going to repeal the term limit thing. And I think that will stay. I think you're stuck with the 2-term limit for president, and on balance, it's probably more good than bad.
Thank you.
I think more use should be made of former presidents. I asked former presidents to do a lot of things, and there's a fine line. You don't want people actually making too much policy, but they can be quite useful, and most of us wouldn't dare backstab one of our successors. You know, we're pretty trustworthy because we've been there.
Very good point.
And been worked over, so we know that.
2 last questions, Mr. President, given our time limits. This is an interesting question. I don't know how one could answer it in a short period of time. What are the long-term consequences of fighting an idea, for example, war on terrorism, as opposed to another nation's state?
Well, first of all, like after 9/11, we finally, you can talk about terror all you want to. I went back and when I was writing my autobiography, I read all the speeches that I'd given about this. And most of them, even after the first World Trade Center bombing, would elicit a giant yawn. And something like 9/11 happens, everybody thinks about it. So it was important to galvanize the country, to show that the government was serious, to show that the president and our other leaders were serious. It was a legitimate phrase to use. But whatever all presidents have to use rhetoric to best effect. But you have to also be wary of the hazards of it and the downside. And if it's a war on a condition that could be more or less permanent, like the war on terror, the war on drugs, the war on poverty, the war on whatever else, you always have to, if you use those phrases to muster public support and galvanize concentration and passion, you have to have a way to be honest and realistic with people about what exactly it is you're trying to do and what would constitute a victory. And also what tools you need to deploy. The problem, the real danger with the war on terror is not the word that terrorists ought to be made war on. It is the implication that you can solve it with weapons alone. Or that somehow you can solve it with weapons, because most terrorist operations still have some nationalist roots or some political objectives. And even bin Laden, when he started, he didn't give a rip about the Palestinians. All he really wanted to do was to overthrow the House of Saud and take over Saudi Arabia. And, then they were, after 9/11, they needed some more legitimacy, so then they'd start mentioning the Palestinians, and then they'd mention first one thing and another. And, of course, he was being harbored by the Taliban, so he didn't like what happened in Afghanistan. But most of these people have political objectives. So it's like it's okay to fight a war on drugs if you say we're succeeding if we cut the imports in half, or we convince our kids to quit using drugs, or we develop therapies that work, or rehab programs that work, or whatever. But the problem with using the word war in any context in which a bullet won't do the job is you have to be then honest with people about what the nature of the conflict is and what we're going to deploy against it and how we're going to keep score to see if we're doing better or not.
Thank you. Excellent. Last question. As an admirer of the poverty alleviation efforts and global health programs of the Clinton Global Initiative, I would like to know how you believe international organizations and donor countries should build infrastructure and institutions that promote growth and sustainability in countries where government corruption is present and quality leadership is lacking. What is the best way to build in-country capacity and corruption-free development, often a result of the natural resource curse, through the support of organizations and initiatives such as your own?
Well, first, that's a very serious, good question, and whatever answer I give you is easier said than done, so we'll posit that. But I think one thing you have to do is to have some standards, and people have to know if you're going to help them, they have to meet certain standards. That's one thing I like about President Bush's Millennium Development Program. It was I thought, a little slow off the blocks, but the idea of conditioning some of our development aid on honest, transparent government and accountability in the expenditure of funds, I think is a very good thing to do. We did that in 2000 with, we had the Millennium debt relief effort, and we said, okay, there are 34 countries that qualify for debt relief based on their income, but they have to honor human rights, and they have to be able to document that 100% of this money goes into education, health, or economic development. Nothing into Swiss bank accounts, nothing into military expenditures, nothing into that. And unless we can certify that it is, they don't get the debt relief. So I think that in general is a good thing. But I also think, since I believe incapacity is a bigger problem than corruption in most places, you have special cases like West Africa with the blood diamonds and other places where you got really a lot of money to slosh around. But usually the corruption follows when there's just a vacuum and people are just, making do. I'll tell you what I do. When I go into a country with our AIDS program, let's just take our AIDS program. We tell people, okay, we can come in and train your personnel and build you a health infrastructure so that you're not just going to be able to deal better with AIDS, you're going to be able to deal better with TB, with malaria, with maternal and child health, with a whole range of issues. And we will get you the least expensive drugs in the world. We now have 500,000 people being treated on these contracts we negotiated that are now about $100 a person a year for adults, $60 a person a year for children. We pay $10,000 in America. The Europeans and the Canadians pay $3,500. When we started, the generic prices were $500 for adults and $600 for kids, and now they're $160. So that's good. But, wait. Well, we say we won't come. Number one, you have to ask us. Number two, you have to work with us to develop a plan, and you have to own it. And number three, there will be no corruption. And the minute there is, we're out of here. I won't embarrass her, but one leader of a country asked me to come in, and but they said that they had to stay with their present drug distribution program. They were paying $880 a year for the same generic drugs that were on the market for $500 before I got them down to $140 and now to $100. So I said, look, if you got to take care of somebody, I said, I'm not in office anymore, so I'm not going to give you a sermon, but give them the money in concrete. You're killing people if you do this. If you spend $880 to treat somebody you can treat for $100, people are going to die who can live. So I can't do this. You just decide. And I never heard back from them. But that was okay. Because for every one like that, there are 25 we're selling the drugs in 60 countries, but we're working in 25 countries where the government asks us in. It's their program. They have to work with us. They agreed to abide by the rules, and then every day we work with them to build capacity. I even had one government, they changed leaders, and the president called me and he said, I got a problem in my health ministry. Will you buy the medicine for a while? Because I don't buy the medicine. In other words, we get money from the Global Fund or from Ireland or Canada or all these other countries. I don't touch government money. It goes to the other country, and they do it. We just monitor it to see that it's done honestly. And he said, I got a problem in this ministry, and I got to fire a bunch of people, but I got to fire some other people first, so will you buy these drugs for 4 months until I can get around to cleaning it out? And that's the only time I've ever bought drugs with government money. Because the guy he understood how committed we were to ending corruption and to building capacity. So you have to have rules, and then you got to be vigorous, but if you do it, you got to be willing to walk away. And it's hard to walk away. Because even that place where they're charging $880 for the drugs, I might have been able to save a few more people, or build a better healthcare network, or walk. But you've got to walk away. You can't have standards unless you're prepared to walk away.
Mr. President. Mr. President, we want to thank the Rice students for their excellent questions. There are many more, but we don't have enough time. And on behalf of all of us, we thank you profoundly for coming to Rice University Baker Institute and sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you very much.
Everybody.